Dr. Gaven Kerr, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Good to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to actually see you now. So this is your, I have to tell you something actually. 2 nights ago, I was with Father Gregory Pine, who I believe is a mutual acquaintance of ours. And we were chatting about you, all good things, about your brilliance and your awesome contributions to philosophy. And he's like, have you ever met Gaven? And I said, not in person. He's like, well, do you know what he looks like? I'm like, yeah, I'm friends with him on Facebook. He's like, he looks like if Wolverine sang for Megadeth. That's Gaven Kerr. I'm like, you've just described absolutely everything that I want to be in life. So I just thought it was such an awesome, and he's a super intellectual academic. I mean, what more could you want? So thanks. Yeah. You can respond to that or ignore it, but Father Pine had many great things to say about you, and it was good to meet him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I met Father Gregory earlier this year when I was teaching theology at Mary Immaculate College, and he was there on behalf of the Thomistic Institute. And it's one of those few times, I'm 6'1" tall, and it's one of those few times where I stood next to somebody and I had to look up to see them because he just towered over me. He's a big tall dude.
Yeah, I think he's 6'4". He was, when I met him, I had to like jump up to shake his hand. It was
yeah. So it was a unique experience, but he was a great guy, and it was great to have him at Mary Immaculate, in the full Dominican habit, swooping around. Yeah, great to see.
Yeah, it's cool. So we're going to do a lot in this conversation. We're going to introduce people to philosophy and metaphysics and maybe Thomism and talk about the existence of God and God's nature. We'll see where it goes. But before we do that, for people who haven't heard our previous conversations, or maybe they're just tuning in on YouTube for the first time, let's do some introductions. Who's Dr. Gaven Kerr, and how did he get to be doing all the stuff you're doing now?
Okay. Well, so I'm Gaven, and as you can probably tell, I'm from Ireland. I'm from Northern Ireland, from Belfast. I was born in Belfast, 1983, grew up in Belfast, lived in Belfast all my life. Currently living in Belfast, but I bilocate during term time because I work in a place just outside of Dublin in Maynooth in County Kildare. So I commute during the week and stay down in Maynooth at my place of work 5 days a week. Otherwise, I'm back up here in Belfast at home with my family. I'm a married father of 3. That's my greatest achievement. I've been married since 2005. So I was 22 when I got married. I'm 36 now, so I've been married 14 years.
Wow.
Met my wife when I was 15. So grew up, sort of finished off our teenage years together. I went to Queen's University in Belfast. I took a degree in scholastic philosophy. Then I took a master's degree where I worked on the distinction between essence and Aquinas, essence and existence in Aquinas. So this was a master's degree by thesis. It was a 50,000 word thesis. And then when I finished that sort of formed the foundation for my doctoral studies, which was looking at the epistemological thought of Aquinas and Kant and comparing and contrasting the two. Basically arguing that Aquinas' account of how mind and world relate to each other is better than Kant's account. Yet Kant is still a real fascinating thinker, and I always return to him. The same way a lot of Thomists and Aristotelians return to Plato, I would always return to Kant for inspiration. So that was my education, and then when I got my PhD, that was 2011. I took a lot of jobs here and there in different colleges. I think what Americans would call it, sort of adjuncting, different wee adjunct positions here and there. And then I got my first full-time position in 2017, teaching philosophy at Maynooth University. And then when that finished up, my wife was pregnant with her 3rd child, so I had to spend a lot of time at home. That was in 2018. But then 2019, just last year, I started teaching theology at Mary Immaculate College, where I met Gregory Pine. And then it's while I was teaching theology at Mary Immaculate College that I got my current position, which is at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. So there are 2 institutions at Maynooth. There's Maynooth University and there's St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. St. Patrick's College, Maynooth was formed in 1795. It was bit of a crazy time in Ireland, and so to kind of settle the craziness of what was going on, it was decided by the British government at the time to set up St. Patrick's College Maynooth, which was the Catholic college in Ireland, and that was to kind of try and settle things down a bit. And St. Patrick's College was set up, and it grew into quite a prestigious college. And then around about the mid-90s, Maynooth University was established, kind of an independence from St. Patrick's College, but connected and joined up to it at the same time. So you have those two institutions, and I've worked for both of them. I'm currently working for St. Patrick's, and I work for Maynooth University. So that's where I am at the minute. I'm also a third order Dominican. Big fan of philosophy, big fan of St. Thomas Aquinas. Done an awful lot of work in Aquinas, medieval philosophy, ancient philosophy. Interested in all branches of philosophy and a lot of the different periods. So that's me. If you want to probe me,
Yeah, and with an introduction like that, it's always difficult. You're one of my favorite people to talk to, and I know I have a good guess when I have difficulty starting a conversation because there's 10 different things I want to talk about all at once, and I don't know where to begin. Right. But let's start with some other common interests before we get into philosophy, because you're also, from what I understand, you're super into fitness, which will be relevant to people in this podcast. I think you just said you hit a personal best on the back squat today, so I want to hear about that. And you're a martial artist as well, right? So you're really a generalist. You're a guy who's into a lot of different things.
Yeah. I mean, with the fitness and all of that, I was always a kind of a very active youngster. So in Belfast, we grew up in a place called Hannistown, which is kind of just on the outskirts of Belfast. If anybody's watched Sons of Anarchy, they'll know in season 3 in Sons of Anarchy, some of it is filmed up in near Hannistown, and Hannistown's even mentioned. So I grew up in and around there, and also some episodes of Game of Thrones, some of the battle scenes were filmed up near Hannistown, near the International Airport in Belfast. So that's part of Belfast that I grew up in. There was a big countryside sort of area. So I was always very active as a child. And as I grew up, I kind of, was interested in getting into fitness. But just given the situation at the time in Belfast, and there was no internet really at this period. So, I mean, I was in my late teens, around about 1999, early 2000s, so you didn't really get much access to the internet. So there was no Google, there was no sort of personal trainers online, there was nothing you could really follow. So when I took to working out, it was difficult to kind of find any sort of program to do. So it really was just upper body work. It was arm curls, shoulder presses, bench press, of course, that sort of thing. Legs were just ignored, and so that didn't really sustain itself. So that was late teens, early 20s. But it was always into my cardio. I was always a good runner, a good hill runner, a good uphill runner. I always had, sort of good endurance for that. So I really got into that, my time at university. And when I was a PhD student, for charity, a bunch of us got together and we did a relay team at the local Belfast Marathon. And, that really got me into my fitness, because training for that, I was going to the gym every day just to get my cardio up, and I met other people at the gym, and I started to get into that. But after that was in my mid-20s. Life sort of, took over, and the sort of the academic work took over. And it wasn't until 2015, and around 2015, that I said to a friend of mine, I was just trying to get into some bodyweight exercises, functional fitness, stuff like that. And he just said to me, and this was the whole sort of change. He just said to me, would you like to borrow my copy of the Insanity workouts? So I don't know about Insanity.
Oh yeah, I mean that gets a lot of people started. I've worked with so many people over the years that Insanity was their entry point to the world of fitness. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I just became addicted 6 days a week, busting yourself to like your lungs were coming out your throat. So, I mean, I fell in love with that. And then after I did all the Insanity programs, I did Body Beast, and that got me into weightlifting. And then I followed a sort of a online blog called The Art of Manliness.
I'm familiar with it.
And the guy in The Art of Manliness, he did Starting Strength with Mark Rivito. So he did Starting Strength program. And so in 2018, I got into Starting Strength. So I started getting into heavy lifting. So the back squats, the bench press, and the deadlift, and the shoulder press. And that really got me into sort of doing the low reps and constantly adding weight every workout. And so at the minute, my fitness regime has kind of been a mixture of high intensity cardio work and heavy lifting. But it's not CrossFit.
Yeah, well, that sounds pretty ideal, and I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people listening to this. I mean, that's pretty much what I do, right? I do a couple days of heavy lifting, some good high intensity like metabolic conditioning, and then a lot of walking. So there's a saying about great minds thinking. Forget what it is. Kidding, of course. But here's a question for you, philosophical question: is there a moral case to be made for fitness? What would Aquinas say about us having? Do we have an obligation to take care of our bodies, to exercise, to eat right? What's the case there? Is there a case there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it, for St. Thomas is very clear that if you're capable of perfecting yourself intellectually and you fail to do so, well, you're failing to realize a potential that you have. And so you're failing to perfect yourself in an important way. But the intellect for St. Thomas, it's not a Cartesian mind, which is sort of separated from the body and just controls the body the way you would do, a character in a video game. Mindedness for St. Thomas is something that a physical being does. So if for St. Thomas, there's a certain obligation on you to perfect your intellect if you're capable of it, such that failure to do that would be a failure to realize the potentiality that you have. Well, I think the same case should also be made for health and fitness, not just maintaining a general level of health so that you can lead, a decent enough life, but to actually work on your health and aim to improve your health to become the best possible version of yourself. Because for Aquinas, human nature isn't separated into mind and body the way it is for Descartes. Human nature is this: the human being is a single substance, a single rational substance. So any attempt to perfect the human substance is going to require some kind of bodily perfection. So the idea is that it's the old Roman idea of a healthy mind and a healthy body. So I would make a case that there is some sort of moral obligation on a person who is capable of it, of perfecting their body in any way they can. And I do think that requires some kind of fitness regime or program, taking some time and putting some effort into doing that in the same way. No,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah. So in the same way that, you need to sort of put some effort into your intellectual life, your spiritual life, you can't ignore your physical life. You can't do those other things to the detriment of your physical life. It's something that when I was in my 20s, it's something that I sort of did. I just focused on the intellectual and the spiritual life at the expense of sort of physical health and fitness. And then when I got my doctorate and I finished my first book and had a lot of articles, I sort of felt that, you have to, sort of work on your physical health, and you have to work on some sort of leisurely bodily activity to distract you from the intellectual life, or to give you peace from it for a certain while, so you can come back to it refreshed.
Yeah. Now Aquinas was a fan of, if I remember right, walking in baths, right? Yeah. Wasn't that sort of his thing?
Yeah, that was it.
And I guess we could also, and it's kind of an interesting thing, because when you study a lot of the ancient medieval philosophers, it seems like to be a philosopher was more of a general thing, kind of a general lifestyle. I mean, Plato was like a pretty good wrestler, from what I understand as well, right? Whereas to be a philosopher today is kind of like you kind of sit in this little academic bubble, right? And you just work out, you do your possible world's logic or whatever. So it seemed like to be a philosopher was just a much more all-encompassing thing. Yeah. And certainly I think there's, even if you try and make like an argument from traditional natural law ethics about obedience to nature or actualizing our potentials, certainly there's opportunity to develop in virtue through fitness. Right. And I think of two main ones would be like temperance and fortitude. What do you think what do you think the relationship is possibly there in terms of like the cardinal virtues and our physical fitness and health? What opportunities could we find?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, virtue is this sort of a habit that you have to work on. So to develop virtue, you need to recognize where your weaknesses are. Say with the four cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude. You need to find out where your weaknesses are, where you're sliding into vice, whether in excess or deficiency. Be self-reflective on that and honest with yourself, and work on getting yourself right in the correct places. And when you are doing a physical fitness routine, say something like powerlifting, you have to be brutally honest with yourself, because if you don't have proper form when doing a back squat, and you've been back squatting, you know, maybe just halfway, not even down to parallel, and you've just been adding the weight on and adding the weight on, and then somebody wants to sort of see your back squat, you know, that you can prove that you can back squat, let's say, double your body weight, and then they keep encouraging you to go parallel, you'll just be crushed under the weight. I mean, the bar catches up with you. It's something that Henry Rollins said, you know, the iron doesn't lie, it tells who you are. So I think something like physical exercise requires you to know where your limits are, and to work within your limits, and then working within your limits to become proficient at that, and then to exceed them and to better yourself. And I think that's what the life of virtue and the work on virtue requires of us, to know where our limits are, where we're not being virtuous, where we're sliding into vice, to work on ourselves, to exceed those vicious limits that we have, so that we can find that golden mean of virtue.
Yeah.
If anything, the life of physical fitness, I think, gives us the sort of mental resolve and mental fortitude to work on ourselves, even when we don't want to work on ourselves, we don't feel like working on ourselves. Getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do an insanity workout, or to lift heavy weights for 2 hours before your day starts, builds a certain kind of character, which is very conducive to not only the virtuous life, but also the spiritual life as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because whatever differences people may have about certain programs of one being ideal or whatever, certainly there's something to be said about developing that habit of I'm going to get up, I'm going to make the sacrifice, I'm going to put in the investment now for my health, for my fitness, and make that small sacrifice in the short term for something that I know is going to be it's going to cause me to flourish long term. And something I think I also see a lot, having been in the fitness industry for a long time, is that, and this is where I think the idea of virtue ethics can be really helpful, is that what can or should be a virtue can quickly slide into a vice. And you see this a lot, where people will take fitness to the extreme, kind of the opposite of what you described. They'll become so obsessed with fitness, or so obsessed with the physical outcome, that they will forget to engage in their spiritual practices or the intellectual practice, or they will neglect their family or their friends. And that's where I think you brought up the virtue of prudence, the sort of chariot virtue, where you have to go back and we have to be brutally honest with ourselves and say, okay, something that should be healthy for me, that should be productive, has now become vicious, and I need to sort of auto-correct or self-correct. And as somebody who's been in the fitness industry for a long time, I actually tend to see almost as much of that, maybe even more of that, than I do the opposite at times, of people who've taken fitness to such an extreme that it actually starts to become vicious in their lives.
Yeah. And I think currently, sort of in Western society at the minute, there is such a cult of physical fitness, and that's a good thing. You know, you've got the likes of your CrossFit and more people doing the powerlifting and all these other programs, but there's become such a cult of it. It's something that they see that they can work on themselves, and they can make very, you know, good progress very quickly at it, that it becomes almost an obsession. And they very quickly slide into the excess of vice, which you talk about. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, fascinating. I know this wasn't what we planned to talk about, but it just came into my mind. So I appreciate your insights on this.
No, I'm happy to talk. Yeah.
No, this is, and it all ties in, doesn't it? Like it's all related in some sense. So if you want good fitness advice, maybe for everyone out there, go to the philosophers, not necessarily the Instagram fitness gurus. So let's talk about philosophy. I wanted to do kind of a basic introduction to specifically metaphysics, and then maybe we could show some application. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about the work you've done on the real distinction between essence and existence, what that even means, first off. But let's just take a step back. People who are totally new, you've specialized in metaphysics. What is that? What are we talking about?
So metaphysics, if we go back to Aristotle, Aristotle has a book called The Metaphysics. And what the metaphysics investigated, it was a set of treatises, and it was placed, the story goes that whenever Aristotle's works were rediscovered in the ancient world, Aristotle had to flee Athens after Alexander the Great died, because Alexander the Great was Macedonian, Aristotle was Macedonian, and there was a lot of anti-Macedonian feeling at the time. Aristotle had to flee Athens, and a lot of his works were left behind, buried in a cellar. They were rediscovered, and they were given to Andronicus of Rhodes to kind of catalogue and put together and make right. And Andronicus put a set of treatises known as the Physics, where Aristotle investigated what's now known as the philosophy of nature. That is, those philosophical ideas and themes which are relevant to our study of nature. So matter, motion, space and time, causality. These were investigated in the Physics. Now, what Andronicus did is that after those treatises on the Physics, he put what were called the treatises on first philosophy, and he put those after the treatises on the Physics. So those treatises on first philosophy came to be known as metaphysics. Now, so that's where the name comes from. It's nothing, sometimes when people talk about metaphysics who maybe aren't really aware of that Aristotelian background, they think it's something beyond the physical, it's metaphysical, it's something spiritual. It's not. It's nothing like, well, at least not for Aristotle. So what the treatises on the metaphysics were, they were the treatises on first philosophy. Metaphysics was first philosophy for Aristotle. It was the primary or fundamental philosophy. And what do you mean by that? Well, what Aristotle holds is that all sciences study being or reality in some sort of way. Now, some sciences study one portion of reality, and other sciences study another portion of reality. So let's take a contemporary example. If we take the three major natural sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, now let's say they have a particular object that they're studying, such as a tree. The physicist is going to study the tree in terms of the universal laws by which it's sort of held in existence, by which it is in place, so the various laws of motion, relativity, all of that. But the chemist isn't going to study that same object in that way. The chemist takes that for granted, thinks it's grand. The physicist looks at that. The chemist is interested in this as an organic being in terms of the various different elements which compose in the being to make it the kind of thing that it is. And then the biologist investigates it as a living being. So as a living being within a particular domain in a relation to other living beings. Now, they're all taking the same object for study, but they have a different particular focus, three different focuses on that object. Well, if you just think about reality then, the different sciences, they all look at reality. You can't have a science of nothing. It's always a science of something. It takes a particular subject matter. So they're all looking at reality or being in a certain way. And Aristotle holds, well, look, there are sciences which cut off a portion of being and only consider that portion. So the natural sciences consider, let's say, reality as constituted by matter, both to be known and to be. The mathematician studies reality as constituted by matter for its existence, but not for its being understood. Whereas the metaphysician just considers being in itself, what it is to be. He doesn't consider a certain subclass of beings. He considers what it is for any beings to be. So as a later metaphysician, Heidegger, as he would have put it, the metaphysician considers the being of beings. In order to do this, Aristotle held that we need to think through the notion of being, what it is like to be. And he held that the notion of being is an analogous notion. So this is a very Thomistic reading of Aristotle. This is the sort of reading that a follower of Aquinas would have of Aristotle. But it's good enough for a general introduction. So for the Aristotelian, being is an analogous notion. And what does that mean? Well, take something, a notion like health, something that is healthy, and you could list all the different sorts of things that are healthy. So fitness is healthy. We'll talk about fitness. It's healthy. What goes along with fitness is a certain diet. Diet is healthy. Medicines are healthy. Bodily fluids are healthy. They're signs of health. We analyze blood, urine, all of that. That they're signs of health. But we're missing a key component for health here. If we just look at fitness, medicine, and all that, what we're missing is the subject of health, the person or the animal who is healthy. Because if we don't have that person or have that animal, which is the primary referent of health, then exercise or just basically activities Medicines are just chemicals. A diet is just food. But exercise is healthy for the subject. Medicine is healthy for the subject. Diet is healthy for the subject. So you take somebody like myself, 36-year-old into his weightlifting, into his, cardio and his martial arts, and you take some sort of, diabetic, 75-year-old. Okay. The sort of exercise routine that would be healthy for me, the subject of health, would not be healthy for the 75-year-old diabetic. Could you imagine them powerlifting or doing, an insanity workout? It would knock them out. The sort of diet which is healthy for me, I mean, I could take, I could have a cheat meal. I could have my tub of Ben and Jerry's, my Mars bar, whatever, and I'd be fine with that. Whereas your diabetic that wouldn't be healthy for them. But then the medicine which is healthy for the diabetic, their insulin, would not at all be healthy for me. That would sicken me completely. So that's health, and that healthiness is an analogous notion. And what Aristotle spotted is that an analogous notion has some sort of primary analogate, a primary referent, and secondary analogates, which have their signification through the relation to the primary. So just as medicine, exercise, diet are only healthy because they bear a certain relation to some sort of primary analogate, which is the subject of health, so too the notion of being is an analogous notion because it has secondary analogates which are or exist or whatever, or given the signification of being, because they're related appropriately to some sort of primary analogate of being. Now, the primary instance of being for Aristotle is substance. Substances are the basic beings which exist. And the secondary significations or analogates of being are accidents. Accidents don't exist unless they adhere or they're related to some substance. So you've got substance, and then Aristotle outlines 9 other categories of accident. So you have substance, quantity, quality, relation, all of that. And Aristotle holds that with these categories of being, all beings fall under that. Every being is either a substance or it is an accident of some substance. And when we investigate these categories then and consider them, we're doing metaphysics. That's what we're doing. We're not just studying one branch of being. We're studying what is common to all beings.
Yeah.
There's nothing that escapes these categories. That's Aristotelian metaphysics. So that way of doing metaphysics then, that became very much entrenched in the Western tradition, right up until St. Thomas Aquinas, who, he builds upon the Aristotelian tradition, but he adds in his own categories as well. But the idea is still the same, that we're looking for those categories which are capable of capturing every being. And by investigating those categories, we will be doing metaphysics, and that's first philosophy, because all the other sciences which consider beings presuppose what metaphysics tells us about the being of those beings. So that's why metaphysics is first, or primary philosophy.
Yeah, so metaphysics is both more fundamental, I would argue more sublime ultimately, right. But it's also, and I think it's a mistake, it is very empirical as well. But it's more analysis by principle rather than analysis by element, like the sciences, correct?
Yeah. And I agree entirely. It's more empirical in the sense that what the metaphysician in the Aristotelian tradition, what he starts with are the medium-sized dry goods that we see around us. We look at beings in the world and we ask ourselves, what is it for them to be? We can look at elements, we can look at the periodic table of elements, and our metaphysics applies there, but we can just look at things around us and it applies there as well. We don't need to tune in to a special realm or dimension, a metaphysical dimension, in order to do metaphysics. That's much more a feature of the Platonic tradition in metaphysics, that there's this special realm that we kind of tune into once we have left our caves, and we tune into this realm, and when we think about what exists in this realm, we're doing metaphysics. For the Aristotelian, to do metaphysics, you just need to think about reality metaphysically, as opposed to mathematically or natural scientifically.
Yeah, so just real quick, because we threw out a lot of terms. When we talk about a substance, we're talking some like being that has a suite of like irreducible like causal powers, correct? Like water would be a substance. I think we could probably argue that, right? Or I'm a substance, and substances are fundamental to reality, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so a substance is that which is said neither of nor anything. So a substance exists neither as part of something or in something. Accidents exist in other things. Substances exist in themselves. This doesn't stop substances from having components. So I agree entirely, water is a substance, but it's also composed of hydrogen and oxygen. The beauty of the Aristotelian metaphysics, which was sort of eclipsed with the modern scientific revolution for a different account of substance, but the beauty of the Aristotelian one is that when we look at water, it's a substance, but it's composed of hydrogen and oxygen. Now, hydrogen by itself is a substance, and oxygen by itself is a substance. But when they are composed to form water, they cease to be substances in themselves, and they become components of a new substance, which is water. And this new substance has various, as you pointed out, causal powers, which hydrogen and oxygen by themselves don't have. So water is wet, you know, it puts out fires, that sort of thing, and that's something hydrogen and oxygen don't do. In fact, you need oxygen to make fire, whereas once it's composed with hydrogen to form water, it puts out fire. Okay, well, the oxygen doesn't do it, but the water does it.
And that's a really interesting point, because some people will say that water just is hydrogen and oxygen. But maybe the Aristotelian might push back on that and say, well, no, there's component parts that can be forced out of the water, or that can be forced into substantial change. But water itself is a legitimate substance that has a sort of qualitative dimension that its virtual parts don't seem to have when they're separate. And maybe we're getting a little too in depth for this conversation, but it's a really interesting thing to think about, isn't it?
I mean, that's Aristotle's notion of substantial form, that all material substances, they have a certain form to them. They're made out of matter, which is this very basic sort of stuff, and that matter is formed in a certain way to give you the kind of thing that you have. So we've talked about water. Water is matter which is formed in the way it is to be water. Now, part of it's being formed like that involves hydrogen and oxygen coming together and relating to each other in a very specific way, H2O. You get another substance, H2O2, which is hydrogen peroxide, I think. Very different from water, but it only has, one particle of a difference there with the O2. So Aristotle's view is that when the matter is formed in a certain way, it's formed by means of a substantial form, and that's what makes it the kind of substance that it is, as opposed to a different substance. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that view was eclipsed with the modern scientific revolution, because in the modern scientific revolution, it wasn't so much those Aristotelian substances which were taken to be fundamental. It was the building blocks or the basic components of those substances. For various reasons, nature or reality was taken to be identified with matter, the very fundamental material component. Motion was divorced from matter, and substantial form was divorced from matter, and it was just material bodies which were taken to signify reality with the modern scientific revolution. With that in mind, then, it was a very quick step to affirming an ancient doctrine known as atomism, that if material bodies are the basic components of reality, then the most basic material bodies, the atoms, are the building blocks of reality. So the physical existent, the physical thing that exists, isn't your basic substance like water or your human being. It's the actual fundamental building blocks, the atoms, that make those up. And that's what identifies the physical existent. So the physical existent then, the true physical existent, is the atom. And then our compound substances are just compounds of all these different atoms put together. The atoms themselves are unchangeable. On the Aristotelian account, hydrogen and oxygen undergo a change when they become a part of water, when they form the components of water. On this newer view, this atomistic view, hydrogen and oxygen, they're unchangeable. They remain hydrogen and oxygen, and they're just put together like Lego bricks to make this compound substance, but they don't change. The Aristotelian notion of substantial form is gone now. We don't have a form making this substance. We just have a bundle of atoms put together. The one modern thinker who accepted that view but also diverged with it and tried to reintroduce a notion of substantial form was Leibniz. So for Leibniz was dissatisfied with the Newtonian worldview, because Newton accepted this sort of atomistic worldview, but one of the problems with atomism is, where does the motion come from? Where does the movement of the atoms come from? It can't come from the matter itself, because matter doesn't have any sort of formal actuating principle, so it has to come from outside. Well, Newton argued, well, God does this. God inputs the motion into things, and that's what gets things going. And every so often, God kind of has to come back and fix things.
Yeah, so everything's kind of extrinsic. Like substances don't have powers in and of themselves anymore. So now you really actually need to just like punt to God to be able to answer some of these questions, right?
Yeah. Leibniz, Leibniz was a theist. He believed in God, but
he wasn't a dumb dude. Well, he like kind of was a smart guy, right? The co-discoverer of the differential calculus. Like, yeah, right?
Exactly. He knew his stuff, and
he knew stuff. That's a good way to put it.
Well, I mean, Leibniz realized that, unless we just, sort of bring God in ad hoc, like a deus ex machina, to kind of fix things that we can't really explain with our physical theory, that's your God of the gaps right there. And Leibniz realized that. We need to return to Aristotle's notion of form and hold that, yes, we have these material bodies, but they're formed in some sort of way, and it's that form which accounts for their causal powers, for their ability to act. And so Leibniz, he kind of, advocated for a return to substantial form. Now,
if I can just highlight why, because some people might be listening, hear us like talking about water and stuff. They're like, oh, wow, this is like, what's the relevance here? And I just want to be clear, like, so much hinges upon this debate, specifically things like the human soul, human rationality, human free will. Because one thing that really struck me when I started taking theist philosophers more seriously, and I was kind of coming out of my naturalism, right, was that there seemed to be a problem, right, of like the categorical gap. Like if reality at bottom is just these sort of physical simples, right? Let's just say I'm a cloud of fundamental particles, and it's just all unaware, undirected, unconscious. There's no teleology. I have to somehow then imagine that all these things just swirled together for some inordinate amount of time, which, okay, all right, maybe I can stretch that a little bit. But then they somehow flipped over into their perfect qualitative opposite. Not just like a different quantity. And the analogy that's sometimes given here is like, I have to imagine that I could build a green tower out of just white Lego blocks. Like there's a qualitative difference here in reality. And how do I account? I didn't think that could be accounted for apart from something like more of an Aristotelian philosophy of nature and metaphysics, where it's actually substances that are like, I as a human, as a rational animal, am more fundamental than, say, the virtual parts, like the particles that I'm composed of. And then that gives me room to have powers of rationality, free will, etc. And I don't have to listen to these, I think, crackpots telling me that I'm just a cloud of fermions and bosons whirling through space, right? Which, like, that doesn't seem to gel. So, like, the point I'm trying to make is not to settle the debate right now, but saying, like, this is actually a really important debate because a lot hinges on it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree entirely. Even if we just take your water example, water is made up of these fundamental particles, no doubt. But the problem always in the philosophy of nature, in ancient thinking, and then in our modern, in the modern revolution, the return to mechanistic atomism, is how do we account for the causal powers? How do we account for the motion? For the Aristotelian, water has causal powers because of its form. The form gives actuality to the matter and brings this sort of physical thing together as this unified whole, which can act in a certain way. Water is wet precisely because it is formed in that way, and it can put out fire because water is formed in that way and fire is formed in another way, and so has these causal powers. When you have mechanistic atomism, then you just have these Lego blocks put together, but you don't have any causal power. It's all static. And so either you go with Newton and you say, look, well, God puts the motion into everything and that's what gets everything going. But then, all of reality is just, on the puppet strings of God. Or you just deny the validity of the question and just say, well, who cares? We can do science on the basis of mechanistic atomism and just forget about the philosophy. And
that's a point you brought up on our last conversation that I want to reiterate, is like the science itself doesn't determine this question one way or another.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a philosophical question, right? So I think that was kind of the point that you made last time, is like, just because certain aspects of reality are not susceptible, say, or they can't be analyzed in terms of physics or chemistry, doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means we need to find a different way of investigating those things. And a common mistake and I think it is a mistake that's pointed out, is people took what was a methodology, this mechanistic methodology that enabled for great predictive success, and they transformed it into a metaphysics. And I don't know if you want to jam on that a little bit, but I just want to make it clear that this isn't like a war of like old philosophy versus science, because science really doesn't tell it one way or another. This is still a philosophical argument at its core, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when we look at the scientific revolution and, you know, the turn to a more Newtonian worldview, what we notice is that what was pushing that kind of change in worldview to a more mechanistic worldview was a certain conception of matter and what matter is, which was in contrast to the Aristotelian conception. So these new scientific thinkers, from what I can tell in the history of it, it was really medical men, medics who were investigating the human body and thinking of the human body more as a machine. They were sort of advocating for this new philosophical notion of matter as these, you know, basic corporeal units akin to the ancient doctrine of atomism. And it was those sort of philosophical discussions about the nature of materiality then which prompted these developments in science. The scientists presupposed a certain philosophical conception of matter, and they went with it, and they did their science on the basis of that. And so when you read Newton, a great book by an Irish writer, by Ernan McMullen, Newton on Matter and Activity, he traces Newton's philosophical development and how Newton came up with his notion of matter, and how he, you know, tried to introduce motion and activity into matter from without. And that, I mean, that had a lasting impact on the image of science and the scientific worldview, but it was all a philosophical framework that was going on. It was traditionally known as the philosophy of nature, that work that Aristotle did in the physics, where we look at matter, motion, space, and time. Those sorts of discussions were going on during the scientific revolution. And what happened is that the science was a great success. So it was assumed that the philosophical notions that were kind of motivating that science were just as successful as the science. But the thing is, this is something that Ed Fieser has argued in his book Aristotle's Revenge. The science can be done just as well with an Aristotelian worldview as it can with a non-Aristotelian worldview. The science doesn't settle the matter, it's of the philosophy. It's the philosophy which settles the philosophy. And so these philosophical discussions aren't going to be determined by an appeal to science. We have to, you know, weigh it into the discussion and analyze the arguments and just have that philosophical wrestling match.
Mm-hmm. So there's the old saying that you can't pull more metaphysics out of science than you put in, right?
Yeah, that's it exactly. And that just reiterates Aristotle's point that metaphysics is first philosophy. Mm-hmm. That we're always going to come back to metaphysics, because a lot of our thinking in science makes, you know, sort of these metaphysical presuppositions, which they don't justify, because why would they? They're not doing science. And so if they want to kind of, you know, read a philosophy off that, they have to enter into metaphysics and do the metaphysical thinking.
So what are some of the, just to for people who are, again, maybe this is the first time they're hearing a conversation like this, what are some of the questions that metaphysicians answer that might be of great interest to the everyday person?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Aristotle's notion of substance and his whole notion of the nature of living substances, I think, is tremendously relevant today, and just your average person will be interested in that today, because Aristotle very famously held that living substances are living precisely because they have a special type of form called anima, which is translated as soul. That's what makes them alive. That's what animates them. And we know this notion of soul is a very popular one today. And, you know, usually when I first introduce this to a person, I can almost guarantee that they have the wrong idea in their head when we mention soul. They usually have a Cartesian idea of this ghost in a machine or a mind. But that wasn't Aristotle's notion. Aristotle's notion was a much more down-to-earth, empirical notion. And it's quite fascinating how that became eclipsed in the history of philosophy, and how in modern culture, the notion of soul is just not the Aristotelian one. The term has been hijacked. Mm-hmm. So I think, Aristotle and Aquinas' discussion of the nature of the human soul and just of soul in general is of tremendous relevance today. I also think their philosophical work on what we were just talking about, matter, motion, space, time, are relevant to contemporary readings of science and interpretations of science. And that leads into the whole science and religion debate, because if, modern science does, or modern purveyors of science do tacitly presuppose a metaphysics, well, that metaphysics is open for discussion. And it's often at the metaphysical level, at the questions of metaphysics, that issues pertaining to religion and the existence of God are hammered out, not at the scientific level. So I think that's relevant today as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think this is a topic that people are always interested in. So yeah. Let's do that, because there is, I think the conflict is obviously superficial, but people perceive that there is some conflict between the scientific worldview and the religious worldview. And I actually want to concede some of that. I think there is a conflict between what some of the conclusions of modern science are and some of what some specific religions say. I'll certainly concede that. And I think that's helpful, right? Because if there is a true religion, we want a way of kind of figuring out what that is. So if something is like, I'll give an example. Like, I think young Earth creationism is incompatible with the conclusions of modern astrophysics. I think that helps us to kind of like narrow down like what might possibly be true in religion. But kind of zooming out, I think we could say, no, in a general sense, they're not only not in conflict, but I think when you properly understand both, we realize there's kind of a deep harmony there as well. So I know I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If somebody were to come up to you and be like, I'm not religious, Dr. Kerr or Gaven, because I believe in science. That's kind of the cliche you sometimes hear, the meme, right?
Yeah.
What's going to be your general response to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just as a practical issue, I would usually ask them, okay, well, what is it in science that, you think, entails that we don't need religion, or that religion is false, or any of the claims made of religion aren't true. So usually we get in and we specify the discussion, and we usually get into a wrestling match. But as a more general approach to that, I typically say, right, okay, so we have science, we have natural science, and natural science, typically divided into the big three areas: physics, chemistry, and biology. And we ask ourselves, right, so, I mean, what are the standard theories in each of these? And, what's threatening, what do we find threatening in those areas to our religious beliefs? Well, in biology, clearly, Darwinism is the big one. Richard Dawkins, he very much, has, pushed Darwinism and evolutionary biology and held, well, this stands in conflict with some very fundamental religious claims. And this is a test case. This is a paradigm case that, this conflict is repeated in a number of other little ways, which just show that religious claims are false, superficial, part of a kind of an intellectual immaturity that humanity had a few millennia ago, but we've outgrown that now. A similar attitude is displayed in physics. So we are in awe at physics. I mean, physics to me is one of the greatest manifestations of scientific thinking, and it's the branch of science which comes closest to philosophy, and it's the branch of science that I'm most fascinated by, because I work a lot in metaphysics, I work a lot in philosophy of nature, and a lot of these issues in metaphysics and philosophy of nature become manifest quite clearly in physics and in cosmology. So a lot of purveyors of physics who are also secularists will hold what modern physics offers us is either a complete explanation of all reality, or the promise of a complete explanation of all reality. If we haven't explained everything yet, then it's such a powerful tool at explanation that we will explain everything. And generally what I say to both those issues is, right, okay, we have very good explanations of physical reality, but so what? These are great explanations of physical reality, but does that rule out God? Well, no, because, and this is the whole business about essence and existence, because what we're trying to explain, first of all, the existence of God isn't there just to explain physical reality. There's also non-physical reality as well that, you know, religious people hold God explains, such as immaterial creatures like angels. Okay, so if we're going to have, say, an argument for the existence of God, it has to account not only for the existence of physical things, but also non-physical things as well for the believer. So if we only have a God who creates the universe, say a designer, well, I mean, we're going to have a hard job explaining, you know, immaterial substances or even the possibility of immaterial substances. So we at least won't get to a God which kind of can account for that unless we tweak it in some sort of way. But what the religious believer holds is not that when we have God as a primary cause, we have some sort of competing explanation for reality, competing with, say, physics, fundamental physics. What the religious believer is holding is that the very existence of anything at all at any point at which it exists depends on this source of existence. That includes everything within the physical universe, and if immaterial creatures exist, everything outside the physical universe. In other words, what the religious believer is holding when they give arguments for the existence of God is that nothing would be were it not for this primary cause. That's not in competition with physics, because physics isn't trying to explain that. Physics isn't trying to explain the very existence of things. Physics is taken for granted that things exist and trying to give the most fundamental explanation of those things, of those physical things that exist in terms of fundamental laws.
So one distinction that I always found helpful is helping people to understand that physics is etiological, right? We're trying to understand how one physical event gives rise to another physical event, where metaphysics is ontological. It asks the question of why are there any physical events at all?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that is, again, I said before that I think metaphysics is more sublime. I think that's just a more sublime and basic fundamental question that's assumed by the physicists. So it's interesting that you brought that up, because it is true. Either people assert, I think falsely, that physics already gives us all the answers that we need. It clearly doesn't, because there's still the answer of why is there, the question of why are there any physical events at all? Or they sort of give you this promissory note that it will give us all the explanations that we need, which again we should be very skeptical of, because if we understand what physics is properly investigating, we understand that it's inherently limited in what it's searching out and what it can find. But also that's assuming a philosophical principle, some type of philosophical principle of explanation, which physics doesn't give you. That's something that's pushed into physics, that we can trace explanations and causes. So it is interesting to see that what seems like kind of a scientific argument is there's a lot of philosophy smuggled into that assumption, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the contrast isn't really between science and religion; it's between science and philosophy, because even your secularist philosopher, who say is in love with science and holds science in very high regard, will grant that there's a legitimacy to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. But he will just hold that his answer to that question is not the theistic answer, but we still need to give an account of why anything exists at all, whereas physics doesn't do that. Physics just takes for granted that something exists and proceeds to investigate it in the way that it does. So, I mean, asking the question of why there is something rather than nothing, it's open to both a theistic and a non-theistic answer. I mean, I've argued that the theistic answer is the right one. Our non-theistic philosophers can say that I'm wrong, and we can get into an argument about that. But we're at a different level of consideration. We're considering a different question than what the physicist considers, because the physicist presupposes that there is something. It doesn't see, the physicist doesn't see the need to ask that question of why there's something rather than nothing, because that's not what they're doing. That's not what they're engaged in. So when your theist comes along, your devotee of religion comes along, he'll say, well, look, I've got an answer to this question of why there's something rather than nothing. If he's not a philosopher, he's got an interesting answer which the philosopher can, interrogate and untangle and see if it's true. If he is a philosopher, then he can give some sophisticated argument for why there is this primary cause. But the conflict isn't with physics or natural science. The conflict is with other philosophers, because he's answering a philosophical question in dispute with other philosophers who are giving different answers to that question, and the physics can just go on doing what it does, and the other branches of science can go on doing what they do. So, I mean, it's something that I've discussed. Sorry, go on.
No, I just think it's such a good point. I think it's so helpful for people to realize that, it isn't ultimately a conflict between science and religion. Ultimately, when you really unpack this, you realize it's a conflict between one philosophy and another philosophy.
Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, a lot of secular people who think that science is the natural conclusion. Science gives secularism as the natural conclusion, are making a philosophical argument on the basis of science. But I mean, I accept everything that the best science tells me, but that's not a sort of a philosophical position. That's just, common sense that I'm not an expert in science. So in a sense, I have to trust the experts. And if I want to comment on something about science which is relevant to philosophy, I'll investigate it myself and do my best at it. But I'm not an expert scientist. And expert scientists are rarely expert philosophers. So I'll do the philosophy and they can do the science. And, we'll just get on with what we're doing. And fortunately, it's in philosophy that we ask, why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah. And, it's interesting. And people always get hung up on the evolution thing. And again, that was never a big thing for me, even when I was a skeptic. I just felt like it just ran itself in circles often, because I mean, even evolution depends on a very special kind of universe. Specifically, universe that seems just precisely fine-tuned, right? And so that's kind of, for people who are interested, the debate around teleology or directedness in nature, the sort of bleeding edge of that right now is in physics. It's not in biology. Of course, the debates still go on in biology itself, but I was always more interested in the physics than I was in the biology. And the more I started to look at some of these arguments from both the theistic and atheistic philosophers, and I became more familiar with the intersection of philosophy and physics, the more I started to tilt toward theism, interestingly enough. And then as I really started to study the work again of the theistic philosophers and your work as well, I realized, well, geez, a lot of the principles that need to be assumed for science to work, the science which I do want to affirm and I'm a huge fan of, that's all we need to make a pretty ironclad deductive argument for God's existence. So it seemed like it was kind of a package deal for me. It seems like if I want to hold to human rationality, if I want to hold to the principles that really make the scientific enterprise valid, it seems like God kind of comes along with that in a way. So maybe you could jam on that, or we could start to get into the work that you've done on essence and existence, and maybe how that is another thing that sort of the sciences more or less assume.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things I always found about St. Thomas is he raises this whole question of the actual existence of things, that that the reality or the real existence of things is an important feature of the things that we see, and it's one that we often overlook. We often overlook the very being of things, and we consider the things that exist, but we don't tend to consider their existence until it's under threat or it's in jeopardy. So until you have death or you see something being destroyed or wiped out, you don't really consider the existence of the things that exist. But St. Thomas was very much attuned to this. St. Thomas realized that amongst creatures, there's a distinction between what they are and their actual existence. Because a lot of things have essences, which signifies what the thing is. So I'm a human being. Rational animality is my essence. That's what makes me the kind of thing that I am, and that puts me in the same species group as yourself and 6 other billion people. So that's our essence. But simply having that essence doesn't make us exist, because there are lots of essences which just don't exist. They're not real. The phoenix is one, Pegasus, unicorns, Gandalf the wizard, all of that, they don't actually exist. They're not real. So what St. Thomas would say, they don't have the act of existence. So the essence and existence in things are distinct. And
I just really quickly, I want to say, like, this is one of those, I think, metaphysical discoveries of St. Thomas that modern science at least implicitly assumes. Like, we assume like that there's a such, obviously, because there has to be like an electron essence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a proton essence in order to make the extrapolations and predictions that we do, right? We can't be like hardcore nominalists, I don't think, and really make sense of science. So I think this is probably an example to show there's not only not a conflict, but science is really just assuming some of these deeper philosophical, metaphysical principles and discoveries, right?
I mean, and that's really because most contemporary scientists are what we call in philosophy realists, that they recognize there are real things in the world and they have these real essences, and their scientific work generally points in the direction of the reality of essences. So the structure of, the atom, or, the structure, of, hydrogen or whatever, it's not something, that we made up in our heads, a la extreme nominalism. There's something real about that which remains real irrespective of whether or not we think about it. So, that tends us towards Thomism and the Aristotelian tradition. So I think you're right there. There's a lot of convergence there.
So I just wanted to get back to your original point, and what you're saying is we realize something interesting, that we can understand the essence of something without automatically understanding whether or not that something exists. So let's keep going with this.
Yeah, exactly. So simply because you can understand the essence of something doesn't mean that thing actually exists. So we understand what a phoenix is. We understand what dinosaurs are. We understand what a T-Rex is, but it doesn't mean that any of them exist. Existence is something distinct from essence. And if anything is lacking existence, it's nothing. It's simply not a thing. It only exists in your mind, which thinks about it. So dinosaurs don't actually exist, except in our minds. When we think about it, or when we watch Jurassic Park or whatever. Phoenixes don't exist unless we think about them, unless we dream them up. They don't have real existence. And this was something that Thomas was aware of. That unless something has the active existence which actuates its essence, it's nothing. It just would not be. It would not be. It is literally nothing at all. And so this was characteristic of St. Thomas's metaphysics. The contrast was between being and nothingness. And what made something be was its active existence, not its essence. Arguably, Plato and Aristotle held the view that so long as a thing had a form, it would exist. So arguably they didn't take seriously the reality of existence, that something that existence is a metaphysical feature of things, without which things would be nothing. So that's a standard sort of interpretation of Plato and Aristotle, and that's a standard interpretation of how Thomism adds to the Aristotelian tradition, because it takes seriously this active existence. So for Thomas then, he wants to know, well, look, why is it that some essences have existence when they may as well not have? It's not natural for us to exist. It's not within my essence to exist. Existence is distinct from my essence. It's part of my essence to be able to laugh. I'm a rational animal, and I'm able to laugh because of my rational animality. I can get a joke and I can laugh. That's something which is a part of my essence. But existence is distinct from my essence. If you follow Thomas's argumentation, essence and existence are distinct. So existence can't be like the ability to laugh in me. It's something distinct from me, in which case there's some sort of extrinsic cause of my existence. I'm dependent for my existence in some sort of way. So Thomas argues, it's a very sophisticated argument, that extrinsic cause can't be another composite of essence and existence. It can't be another thing like me, in which essence and existence are distinct. Ultimately, it has to kind of be derived from something which is just pure existence itself, in which all things participate in order to exist. There's a lot of twists and turns which go into that argument, but that's the general gist of his argument.
Yeah, and we did a deeper episode on this, so I'll point to that and link to that for anybody who wants to really take a deeper dive in this. And obviously, we're going to mention your books at the end too, because you have a lot of great written work on this. But I think this is a really important point, just to highlight a few elements of what's being said here. And like we can be like really quite certain about this, because if we try and work through the implications, like, okay, you said, okay, I have the ability to laugh. That's something that flows from my essence of being rational. But it doesn't seem like existence could be something that flows from my essence, because that would assume that I already exist, right? Exactly. So then we would enter into this vicious circularity. So that can't be the case, right? Because I would already have to already exist for existence to flow from it. And that just won't work, right? So it seems like you can't say that existence is something like risability or my ability to learn languages, because it's much more, it's a distinct real metaphysical principle. But I think at the same time, what you and Aquinas argue rightfully is it can be distinct but inseparable. Like you can't separate it out, because that won't work either. But they are really distinct. So we need to ultimately explain how this finite, limited, contingent thing came into existence. Like, what is imparting existence in this particular way rather than some other particular way? And the other thing you mentioned, which I think is a good point to emphasize, is that Pat Flynn obviously doesn't exist necessarily. Like, I don't exist in virtue of what I am, not only because there was a time when I didn't exist. There will be a time, hopefully not too soon, when I go out of existence, right? But if existence just was Pat Flynn, then it seems like everything would have to be Pat Flynn. Right? We kind of land into another absurdity. Like, if I existed just because I'm Pat Flynn, or existence just was Pat Flynn, then there wouldn't be a Gaven Kerr, right? So it's clearly not the case that existence is equal to this particular limited contingent thing. So I think what we're doing in this argument, and like I get excited about this because this was something I wrestled with for a while. At first, like, it made no sense to me. And then, like, there was a time when it just like clicked. I'm like, oh man, wow. Yeah, no, I get it. That's right. We're stripping away limits, and we're peeling it, and like we realize that these limit contingent finite things cannot be explained by further limited contingent finite things. And we ultimately need to get back to something that is qualitatively unlimited, that is existence in the full and perfect plenitude, and perfectly self-subsistent. Through which everything else, and I'll let you clean up the mess I'm making here, that everything else is really existence with a set of minuses, right? It's existence with a set of limits or restrictions. And that God, properly understood, is that subsistent active existence with no limits, no restrictions, no boundaries. And because of that, he would exist necessarily eternally. And then we can unpack all the other divine attributes here. And what so impressed me about Aquinas and reading contemporary Thomists like your work is, like, we can know this through those first principles of metaphysics, right? Like, and we can be really sure of it. And not only is it not in conflict of science, I think it actually helps to really clarify science. So I'm sorry for the horrible presentation of all that, but I'll let you clarify and clean up everything I just threw out.
Yeah, I mean, the one sort of piece of argumentation that really hit it for me was considering a particular kind of causal chain, what Thomas calls the per se causal chain. He gives this example of the mind moves a hand to move the stick to move the stone. And he argues that, well, look, see in that sort of series, mind moving hand to move the stick to move the stone, we have a kind of causality at work there, a causal actuality at work, which is motion. Now, the hand, the stick, and the stone don't naturally move. They don't move in virtue of what they are. Hands, sticks, and stones are just immobile in virtue of what they are. They need something to give them motion. The mind, or the mental agent, or whatever you think accounts for intentional activity, moves in virtue of what it is. That's just what it can do in virtue of what it is. That's like your risability with the human essence. It's just something that flows from the mental agent. It is able to induce motion to the hand, the stick, and the stone. So the hand, the stick, and the stone, they don't have the motion or the causality in virtue of what they are, and they are dependent on the mind or the mental agent for that causality. They participate in the causality of the mental agent. So the hand and the stick, they're the secondary causes precisely because they don't have the causality of the series in virtue of what they are. And the mind is the primary cause because it does have the causality in the series in virtue of what it is. Now, a key thing about that series is that if you remove that primary cause, the motion just drops out of the series. There is no motion in the series. The hand and the stick and the stone just wouldn't move because they're naturally immobile. So without a primary cause, hand, stick, and stone just are immobile. They're lost. You don't have a causal series. Well, Aquinas applies that to the case of existence. Things in which essence and existence are distinct are like our hands and sticks in the motion series. They have some sort of causal actuality, that of existence, but they don't have it essentially. They don't have it in virtue of what they are. Now, just like in the hand, stick, stone series, if you don't have a primary cause, or if you take away the primary cause, you just don't have motion in the series. because the primary cause originates the motion in the source in virtue of what it is. Well, similarly with the essence and existence scenario, if you don't have a primary cause of existence, which is capable of originating existence in virtue of what it is, then you just don't have existence. Nothing would exist. You just don't have the causal actuality of existence, because everything in which essence and existence are distinct, none of those things exist naturally. None of those exist in virtue of what they are. So unless you have something which does exist naturally in virtue of what it is, you won't have the existence of anything at all.
Yeah, and that's a really, I think, powerful point when properly understood. I mean, again, like, think of me, that existence for all these sort of finite, limited instances of being it's really borrowed. It's like something that's lent to us or donated to us at any instant that we continue to exist. So, like, this is seemingly obvious, right? If you like kick out the sort of prior ontological conditions that support my existence, like if you just kicked out, you know, the strong force, for example, or something, or just took away the earth, right? Goodbye, Pat Flynn, right? So I'm like super dependent on all sorts of prior conditions and causes for my existence here and now. So in respect to what you're saying, yeah, like whatever my essence is, it is having existence donated to it. Not just when I came into existence, but here and now, at every instant that I continue to exist. And what this argument is attempting to demonstrate, what you're saying is like, unless there is something that has existence in virtue of what it is, that just is existence as such, in a qualitatively perfect way, nothing else could possibly exist, because then we would just have a line of just existential zeros, right? Like like a majorly I love the way that Dr. Fazer puts it. It's like a bunch of IOUs that are backed by nothing, right? Like if thing A is dependent on thing B is dependent on thing C, well, then we're always like one plus more condition out than could ever be fulfilled. So we're just saying it would never have come to exist in the first place. So the whole idea of an infinite regress, I don't think will save you from this argument. Like we have to, the metaphysical buck has to stop somewhere, right?
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point that existence is donated to us. It's borrowed. It's given to us. Because one of the things that's sort of really struck me when I was researching my second book on the metaphysics of creation is that for St. Thomas, God's creating things isn't just a magic trick. It's not. It requires a sheer act of omnipotence. But it's not a magic trick. It's not a sheer act of power. And this is precisely because, as you point out, existence is donated to us and we borrow it. Now, we could do nothing to merit our existence because we didn't even exist to be able to do anything to merit it. So God gratuitously grants us existence for no reason whatsoever. Well, for a reason, but it would seemingly be that it just seems completely gratuitous for God to grant us existence. But when we think about existence, it's the greatest good that anything could possibly have, because without existence, there would be no actuality whatsoever. All actuality depends on the actuality of existence in some sort of way. And all goods thus depend on existence, because every good that we have perfects us or completes us in some sort of way. So it signifies a kind of actuality. You take a mundane example, you go for food, you have a need, you're lacking in something, you get your food and it completes you or it actualizes you in some way. It fulfills you, very clearly in the case of food. So existence is the basis for all actuality. So existence is the fundamental good that we have. So God, in granting us existence, is sharing goodness with us. And we didn't even exist in order to merit that goodness. So it's entirely gratuitous. Now, to grant the good or to will the good for something else is to love that thing. That's what to love somebody is to will their good. You love something precisely because you will only the good for it. But we didn't even exist prior to the act of creation to merit the good of existence which God wills us. So for Aquinas, the act of creation is one sheer act of love. That God, in his goodness and sees within himself, wishes to share his goodness with others. And so the act of creation requiring this great act of power is an act of unconditional love. It's not conditional upon our meriting it because we couldn't have done anything to merit it. So it's a sheer act of unconditional love for creatures.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, doesn't that just make you want to like get down on your knees and pray? Like God's act of creation, he's literally loving us into existence, right?
Well,
Not just when we came to exist, but here and now, right? At every moment. And that's the radical conclusions of these types of arguments. It's not like we're just trying to like trace back to some point in time, right? Like the Big Bang say. And I know those people make those types of arguments, like the Kalam arguments, stuff like that. Aquinas is, I think, much more fundamental and much more penetrating, because we realize the conclusion is nothing would exist for a single instant apart from God. Like if he stopped thinking about us for a brief, like we're gone, poof, goodbye. And that every single moment we continue to exist, it's because God is literally loving us into existence here and now. I mean, how philosophically beautiful is that? It makes you want to go to church, right?
Well, I mean, there's also another corollary to that. It's that because God loves us into existence, not in virtue of anything which we have done to merit it. So we didn't merit God's love, yet he loves us. But it also has the flip side that we can't demerit God's love either, because he doesn't love us in virtue of what we are, because we didn't even exist for him to love us. He loves us in virtue of himself. So no matter how much we can change and flip back and forth, his love for us is still constant. So there's nothing that any creature could do to cause God to stop loving it. Like literally nothing that any creature could do to cause God to stop loving it, precisely because God loves us and creates us to exist simply in virtue of what he is. And he doesn't change, so his love for us doesn't change. And it's that idea and that notion, which sort of, makes me want to get down on my knees and worship God. That it recalls the first letter of St. John, chapter 4, that, that this is the truth, that God loved us first, and all we have to do is return that. That's the primacy of God's love, and that's a big thing in the Johannine sort of gospel and the Johannine letters, is the primacy of God's love. And I think that, Aquinas' whole metaphysics of creation draws that out perfectly.
And isn't that a beautiful thing too, is again, like, for God so loved the world. And this is part of the usefulness of philosophy, is like, one, that should be very reassuring to people, because I know sometimes people get held up talking more on a theological note. There is like, they feel really guilty, like, how could God ever love me, right? Or things like that. And you hate when people, you see people in that state, you want to lift them up and be like, hey, actually we have really good reasons of like why God not only loves you, but will never stop loving you. For the exposition that Dr. Kerr just gave, but it also helps us to sort of, again, narrow our theological scope. Hey, well, what world religions talk about God's love in this unconditional way? And what religions make God's love contingent? Because any religions that would make God's love contingent don't seem to match up with what we can know philosophically about God. So I think that's where philosophy can be really helpful, is that it can help sort of narrow the list of possibly true religions, in the same sense that science can to a degree, right? And I think this is a really important one, because it hits you right in the heart, right? And it's like, I'm with you. Like, this is a God that I not only can, but will gladly kneel before and pray and worship. This is a God that seems to me that is truly deserving of worship.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there, that there are only so many theological frameworks which will expressly state that, God is love, and God's primary relation to anything whatsoever is love itself. And that's a major theme in the New Testament, and that's a major theme of the revelation that Christ brings. And that just happens to be in accord with what I submit our best philosophy, our best metaphysics can tell us. I mean, I don't think that's a coincidence, because I think both of them are pointing towards a particular truth, one through revelation and the other through natural human reason. And the two of them come together and sit nicely. It's such a beautiful harmony there. It's funny that you bring that up, because sitting right next to me is, I don't know if you've read this one by Father Spitzer, God So Loved the World. Oh yeah. I read Spitzer's other book. It was New Arguments for the Existence of God. I haven't read that one.
It's very good. It's more to the points that we're kind of working on here. But I mean, that's such a wonderful note. I would hate to even sully it with any further points from me. But you've been super gracious with your time. I know it's really late over there, so I don't want to hold you any longer. But before and of course I'll be bugging you to come back on. You're one of my favorite people to talk with. Before we go, I want to make sure that people grab your work, because you do such good work. Your books are awesome. Give us all the details and updates there. What do you have out for people? And what are you currently working on? I know you had kind of a book on the 5 proofs that you've been hammering out, right?
Yeah. So let's see. So my first book was published by Oxford, 2015. That was Aquinas' Way to God. That's where I really get into that proof for God's existence on the basis of essence and existence. So that was the first book. The second book then was Aquinas on the Metaphysics of Creation, where we look at what it is, where I look at what it is for God to create, given that God is pure existence itself and creation is conceived of as granting existence to things. And that book finishes up then with this whole notion that creation is an act of love, that God loves us into existence. If you go to my staff page on the St. Patrick's College Maynooth website, so if you just go to the staff, you'll see me there. And you'll just see a list of my publications, lots of different articles here and there, things that I'm interested in. I do other work in philosophy other than metaphysics. I'm interested in epistemology and different areas of philosophy and the history of philosophy. Currently, I'm bringing to completion the work on the 5 ways. I had a few weeks hiatus there, a bit of an extended hiatus, just because it was marking season, essays to mark, that sort of thing. So research always goes on the back burner at that time, but I more or less finished it, and I'm just into kind of, going over the editing stages and, touching things up and everything. So God willing, I'll be submitting the manuscript soon. I'm also working on a response to Graham Oppy's response to Ed Feezer, and can't really say anything yet as to the process with publication with that, but things are looking positive anyway with regard to publication of that, so it could appear soon, this response to Graham Oppy, but then again, it just with publishing, it may not appear, so we can't really say one way or the other, but I am working on this, and so hopefully something will appear responding to Graham Oppy's response to Ed Feezer. Other than that, when I get this book on the 5 ways finished, which hopefully will be soon, I want to start researching the metaphysics of the resurrection.
Very cool.
Because I've done the existence of God, I've done creation, so I want to look at resurrection. And I think I think maybe a Thomist should sit down and go through Aquinas on the resurrection and give a Thomistic presentation of it. I don't think one has been done lately, so I think that's maybe timely to do that.
Well, yeah, you're definitely going to get a vote yes from me on that one. That sounds like an awesome project. Right. Actually, it just popped in my mind. I'm going to grab an extra copy of Aquinas' Way to God. We'll do a giveaway too. So
okay, yeah,
just get more of your work out there. That'll be good. So if you want a chance to win a copy, definitely go out and buy Dr. Kerr's book. It's worth it. But we'll do a giveaway on top of that. If you want a chance to win, just drop a comment wherever you're watching. On YouTube, or if you're listening on iTunes, just email me, Pat Flynn at Chronicles of Strength, the subject line podcast. I'll just pull name there randomly. So,
right.
And in the meantime, I'll link all of your current work in the show notes, so including our previous episodes. And yeah, Gavin, always a pleasure. This is such a blast chatting with you.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. I always enjoy being on. Thanks.
Of